The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline when the first shot went wide. Not by much. 8 inches at 1,200 meters means nothing to a civilian. To the 15 men standing behind the firing line at Camp Pendleton's advanced marksmanship complex, it meant everything. 8 inches at that distance meant a missed target in training. 8 inches in the field meant a body bag with your brother's name on it. Chief Petty Officer Garrett Rourke pressed his forehead against the warm stock of his M24 and said nothing. The steel target downrange stood untouched, swaying slightly in air that held no wind. The range flags hung limp from their poles. No gust, no mirage shimmer off the valley floor. No equipment failure he could identify in the seconds between the trigger break and the impact that did not come. The shot had gone wide and the morning offered no explanation for it, and 20 years of accumulated precision burned in his chest like a coal that would not go out. He had been called Hammer since Fallujah. The name came from his first deployment when a sergeant major watched him drive 3 rounds through the same ragged hole at 800 meters and said the man did not shoot like a sniper. He drove nails. The name followed him through Afghanistan, through 2 classified operations he still could not name, in a room with civilians through a decade of training younger men who would go on to earn names of their own. He had worn it without self-consciousness because he had earned it and because names in his world were not given lightly and not taken back. Hammer did not miss, except that he had. Twice already this morning, and now a third time. The annual qualification. Every operator who carried a rifle passed it or did not carry the rifle. The standard existed because the people who wrote it understood that in the world these men occupied the margin between acceptable and unacceptable was not a number anyone had ever been comfortable writing down. Garrett rolled his shoulder, felt the familiar tightness that had lived there since a hard landing in Kandahar 11 years ago, and settled back into position. Declan Frost stood 6 feet behind him, with his arms crossed and his expression carefully arranged into neutrality. At 32, Declan had learned the specific skill of being present without adding weight to a situation that already had enough. He had learned it from Garrett, who had learned it from someone else, which was how the useful things passed through the community, not through instruction exactly, but through long proximity to people who had already figured out what mattered. Whitfield Acres was not demonstrating that skill. Wind's dead, Whit offered from somewhere to Garrett's left. 26 years old. 2 deployments. More confirmed engagements than men twice his age. He meant well, which in this specific context made it worse. Maybe the scope mount worked loose overnight. Temperature swing will do it. Garrett did not respond. Brennan Saul, the team's designated marksman, crouched near the equipment table examining his own rifle. Brennan was 35 and produced roughly 4 words per hour under normal conditions. He had a quality of presence that managed to be complete without being intrusive. He was entirely in a room without occupying any space that wasn't his. He looked at the distant target, looked at Garrett, and returned to his rifle. Crawford Finch, who had never successfully resisted the compulsion to say the thing everyone was thinking, leaned against the observation post and addressed the tree line beyond the range. Might be the rounds. New lot number. I had 3 flyers last Tuesday with the same head stamp. The rounds are fine, Garrett said. Right, yeah. Crawford examined his thumbnail with apparent interest. Just a thought. Gunnery Sergeant Lorna Pruitt watched from the tower. 45 years old, 8 years running this particular range, she had cataloged every variety of frustration that accomplished men produced when their bodies declined to cooperate with their reputations. She had a cup of coffee going cold on the railing beside her, and she did not offer commentary because the range was her domain and these men were guests in it, and she had learned long ago that the most useful thing she could do when a situation was developing was to stay clear of it and pay very close attention to everything. She was paying very close attention. Garrett exhaled slowly, centered the crosshairs on the steel plate 1,200 meters away, and let the world reduce itself to the circle of glass in front of his right eye. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat, he could feel it in his fingertip against the trigger, came down towards something steady. He fired. The report cracked across the complex. A second and a half of waiting. Then nothing. No ring of impact from downrange, no bell tone of steel, struck clean. The target stood untouched for the 4th consecutive time, and Garrett lowered the rifle and pressed his palm flat against the earth and was very still for a moment. Take 5, Declan said, not to anyone specifically. Water. The team moved with the efficiency of people who had learned to give a leader room without making the giving of it visible. They dispersed along the berm, occupied themselves with equipment and conversation that had nothing to do with the firing line, and did not look back. Garrett remained on his mat and worked through the problem methodically the way he worked through any problem, starting from what he could verify moving outward, not assigning cause until cause was established. He was still working when the gate guard's voice carried across the complex. She had her credentials out before anyone thought to ask for them. That was the first thing Garrett noticed when he finally looked up, not her age or her size or the clipboard tucked under her left arm. The credentials. She had anticipated the checkpoint and prepared for it, which meant she had been here before and had paid attention to how it worked. Specialist Sierra Callahan, Supply 2nd Battalion Support Company. Weekly ammunition inventory. Thursdays, 700. Standing appointment. She walked toward the firing line at a pace that suggested she had done this before, and expected to finish quickly. She stood perhaps 5'4" in standard boots. Her dark hair was regulation. She appeared to be somewhere in the vicinity of college age, and the men on the line registered this fact in the way that men register things they find incongruous with commentary. Crawford said, "Tell me someone didn't send admin support to count rounds while we're shooting them." Whitakers looked at Declan. Declan looked at the sky with the expression of a man appealing to a higher authority that had historically declined to intervene. "Logistics has this block at 0700, Sierra said, without looking up from whatever she was writing. Her voice was quiet and carried no particular investment in being believed. "Every Thursday. It's on the schedule. We have the complex until 0800, Garrett said. He had pushed himself to his feet without consciously deciding to old reflex standing when something was coming toward him. Active qualification in progress. Non-essential personnel clear the area. The block runs to 0800, yes. She made a notation. It's 718. I'll be done before that. Crawford opened his mouth. Declan placed a hand on his shoulder and Crawford closed it. Garrett studied the young woman the way he studied unfamiliar terrain, looking for what did not fit what was more or less than it appeared. What he found was a specialist in a support position with correct credentials, who was in the correct location at the correct time and appeared entirely uninterested in the fact that 15 armed Navy SEALs were watching her write things on a clipboard. "How old are you?" Witt asked. He framed it as a joke, or nearly. 21. She did not look up. "I was on my second deployment at 21. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown and completely level. "I know. Your service record is in the battalion file. I processed supply requisitions for this team. I've read the unit summary." She returned to her notes. 21 months downrange by age 22. That's a serious record. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the texture of a room full of people who are accustomed to being the most informed individuals present and have just discovered they are not. Lorna Pruitt set her coffee down on the tower railing and leaned forward slightly. It was Sierra who ended the silence, and she ended it without drama, addressing the distant targets rather than the men, her voice pitched just above what the ambient noise required. "Your 0 is off," she said. "Not the mount, not the ammunition lot number. The 0 itself, approximately 3 minutes of angle, high and right." Garrett turned slowly. "What did you say?" 4 shots, same deviation. That's a mechanical pattern, not a shooter pattern." She tilted her head slightly. "Someone adjusted that scope since it was last confirmed and made the adjustment without accounting for the barrel's specific harmonic profile. The range was quiet except for the absence of wind. I have been shooting professionally," Garrett said, keeping his voice at the temperature of something just below the point of damage, "since before you enrolled in whatever school you attended. That rifle was zeroed by my armorer at 0500 this morning." "Your armorer zeroed it at controlled temperature in an enclosed facility," Sierra said, still not looking at him. "This complex runs about 11 degrees warmer than the armory. The barrel has been in direct sun for 40 minutes. Thermal expansion affects point of impact by roughly half a minute of angle per 10 degrees. She made another note. 3 shots high and right at 1200 meters is consistent with that shift layered on top of the original adjustment error. Garrett looked at Declan. Declan had the expression of a man watching something he would find difficult to describe accurately to someone who had not been present. Crawford said very quietly, "She counted." Witt said, "I know she counted. I know she." Lorna Pruitt had her phone out. She was not recording. She was running a name through a database, her thumb moving quickly, her eyes moving between the result and the young woman standing 40 feet below her on the firing line. Garrett crossed his arms. He applied to Sierra Callahan the same assessment he applied to everything accurate, stripped of preference, concerned only with what was actually there. What was actually there was a specialist in a support role who had, in under a minute, correctly identified a technical problem that his team's lead instructor had spent 20 minutes attributing to conditions and equipment failure. She had identified it correctly. He had not argued because she was not wrong. A younger man might have escalated here. Garrett Rourke was 44 years old and had buried 6 men whose mistakes he had not caught in time. He had no interest in being right. He was interested in being accurate. If your analysis holds, he said, then compensating manually for a 3-minute offset at variable distances is not a basic exercise. No, Sierra agreed. Can you do it? She set her clipboard on the equipment table with the unhurried precision of someone setting down something they intend to pick back up. She looked at the shooting gloves laid out near the mat, turned them over once, and set them aside. I won't need those, she said. Crawford quietly to nobody. She's going to shoot it. She settled into position and the character of the range changed. Garrett had spent 2 decades studying how people hold rifles because the way a person holds a rifle is a complete biography. It tells you who taught them, how long ago, how seriously the instruction was taken, and how deeply it was absorbed. There were men with 20 years behind a rifle who still held it like something recently handed to them. There were men who had been shooting since before they could legally drive, who held it the way you hold something you were born missing. Sierra Callahan held the M24 like the second category. Every angle was correct without being performed. Every point of contact, cheek, shoulder support, hand-firing hand, was exactly placed. Her body did not fight the rifle. It accommodated it the way water takes the shape of whatever contains it. This was not a position coached into her on a range somewhere with an instructor adjusting her elbow. She had grown into it over a very long time, and it showed in the complete absence of visible effort. Her breathing changed, slowed, then slowed again until it was barely perceptible from 6 feet away. Declan moved 2 steps left to see her better. He did not realize he had done it. She did not fire immediately. She waited with the quality of waiting that belongs to people who have already completed every calculation and are now simply holding still until the moment they identified arrives. It was not the weight of hesitation or doubt. It was the weight of someone who understood that the shot did not belong to the shooter until the shooter had earned the right to release it. Then the rifle fired. 1,200 meters downrange, the steel target rang. Not a glancing strike. A clean center impact, the bell tone carrying back across the valley a beat and a half after the report. Lucky, Witt said immediately. His voice carried the specific uncertainty of someone who did not believe the word he was using. Sierra worked the bolt without lifting her cheek from the stock. One smooth motion, spent casing arcing, right new round chambered. She made an adjustment so small that the observers could not have described what changed, only that something had. A fraction of something. A degree of something else. The second shot, 1,400 meters different target. The ring came back dead center. The joking had stopped. The third shot was the one Garrett had been watching for. She shifted toward the 1,500-meter plate, his troubled target, the one he had been assigned, the one that had been silent since 0600, and that his team had been carefully not discussing. She held her breath longer this time, long enough that Declan, watching involuntarily, held his as well. The rifle fired, a full second and a half. Then the distant, clean, unmistakable sound of steel struck perfectly. She did not lower the rifle. She engaged 5 more targets, 400 to 1,500 meters in a sequence that moved up and across the range without pattern or hesitation. 8 shots total, 8 impacts. When she finally sat back, the range was absolutely silent, except for the fading echo of the last strike. She stood, brushed dust from her uniform, retrieved her clipboard. Nobody spoke for a moment. Garrett studied her and felt something he had not felt on a range in a long time, the specific quality of attention that arrives when you are looking at something rare. The way you feel in the field when you observe a detail in the environment that does not follow the expected pattern, and you know before you understand why that it carries meaning. First shot, he said, 6 inches high at 1,200. You drifted because you hadn't accounted for the thermal gradient off the ground surface. Morning air, warm earth, the disturbed layer between the barrel and the target. He paused. You corrected on the second round, but you did it by feel, not calculation. The feel is good. The analysis is better. Whoever taught you covered everything except this range at this hour. Sierra had stopped writing. She was looking at him. Who trained you, he said. The question landed differently than he had intended it. He saw it in the change around her eyes, not pain exactly, but the thing adjacent to pain that people learn to build structures around. My father, she said. She said it the way people say the names of things that used to exist. The memory came without invitation. She was 7 years old and the ground smelled of dry grass and the rifle was enormous. Her father lay beside her in the prone position on a strip of hard-packed earth at the edge of a property that appeared on no county record accessible by a dirt road that turned off a state highway 40 miles from the nearest installation. He had spent 4 days teaching her to breathe before he let her touch a rifle. 4 days of lying in the grass and learning the rhythm of her own heartbeat and finding the space between exhale and the next inhale where everything briefly went still. She had been impatient. She had said so. He had said the shot happens in the space between heartbeats. You cannot rush the space. You can only learn to find it. On the fifth day, she had found it, and the rifle had fired, and 350 meters downrange, a steel plate had rung, and her father had said nothing for a moment, and then said quietly again. She put the memory back down. Deliberately without suppression, set aside in the place her father had taught her, to put things that needed to wait until the work was finished. The work was not finished. Lorna Pruitt came down from the tower with the measured pace of someone who has learned that hurrying toward a developing situation rarely improves it. She stopped near Garrett and held out her phone. I ran her name through the advanced marksman registry while she was shooting, she said. Her voice carried the tone of someone presenting information they find significant and are choosing not to editorialize about. You should read this. Garrett looked at the screen. The entry was brief, with the specific brevity of records where the omissions outweigh the text. Junior Distinguished Marksman, age 12. Pendleton Range record established at age 14. A column of training qualification scores that he read twice because the first reading seemed like a misreading. It was not a misreading. That can't be right, Declan said, reading over his shoulder. The record stands, Lorna said. Garrett looked at Sierra with the attention he reserved for situations that were changing in ways he had not anticipated and needed to understand quickly. The young woman was watching him with the expression of someone who has been through this specific moment before and knows its sequence and is waiting with moderate patience for it to proceed. Callahan, he said. Yes. Sierra Callahan. He said it slowly, working the name the way you work the name of something you know you have filed somewhere. Your father. A pause. Barely a breath. Thomas Callahan, she said. The range went quiet in a way that was different from all its previous silences. This was the quiet of 15 men who had just heard a name that existed at a specific altitude in their professional world. The altitude where the real legends lived, not the performed ones, but the ones that other serious people discussed in low voices, and only when the conversation had earned it. Thomas Callahan. Thomas Wraith Callahan. Marine Scout Sniper, 22 years. Confirmed engagements still classified at levels most of the men present lacked clearance to access. A technical manual on long-range precision shooting used in advanced programs across the country that did not carry his name on its cover because it could not. An instructor whose methods had been studied at every major marksmanship school in the United States, usually without attribution, because attribution required acknowledgement of the operations the methods were attached to. And 5 years ago, on a classified mission in the American Southwest, Thomas Wraith Callahan had been listed as missing. The official paperwork said one thing. The people who actually knew said several other things, none of them consistent with each other. Whitakers said very quietly, Wraith has a daughter. Colonel Aldous Haynes arrived at the range entrance at that moment with the timing of a man who has spent 34 years cultivating information sources and knowing which phones to keep charged. He was 58, silver-haired, and he moved with the unhurried authority of someone who had stopped needing to demonstrate anything through pace approximately 15 years earlier. He surveyed the range, the team, the rifle on the mat, and finally Sierra Callahan, and he stopped. He looked at her the way you look at someone you last saw as a child and are now adjusting the image of in your memory. I knew your father, he said. Yes, sir, Sierra said. I know. Haynes walked closer, studying her, not her face exactly, but the specific architecture of how she carried herself. Then the way you hold a rifle, left thumb under the grip. Thomas showed me that adjustment in 2003 at Quantico. He'd been doing it since a gunnery sergeant, whose name I've lost, drilled it into him during his first tour. He paused. I've seen it in maybe 4 other shooters in my career. He let the observation settle. He taught you everything, Haynes said. Not a question. Not everything, Sierra said. Haynes studied her for a moment. Then he said, come with me. She followed him to the range control building, and Garrett, who had been following 4 paces behind without invitation or dismissal, came inside and stood against the wall. The building smelled of gun oil and old coffee and the institutional cleanliness of facilities that have been cleaned so many times it has become part of the structure. Haynes sat. He put his hands flat on the operations table. He looked at Sierra. "You are not here for the inventory," he said. Sierra set her clipboard on the table. She opened it. Below the inventory sheets were 8 months of records, shipping manifests, inspection logs, cross-referenced serial numbers, a grid of dates and locations and unit designations laid out in handwriting that was small and extremely precise. 14 items over 8 months, she said. Precision optics, thermal scopes, advanced rangefinders. Each one removed from service between scheduled inspections. Each one replaced in the paperwork with documentation showing it was never present to begin with. She placed her finger on a specific row. The 8th item disappeared 3 weeks ago. The pattern matches 7 previous thefts across 3 bases. She moved her finger to an adjacent column. This column is deployment schedules, units that deployed short this equipment. She looked at Haynes directly. Each shortage corresponded with a unit suffering casualties at distances their gear should have protected them from. The room was very still. "The 8th item," Garrett said from the wall. Something in his voice had changed, not dramatically, but in the way that a room changes when someone opens a window. "What was it?" A N/PVS-31 night vision monocular paired thermal attachment and a SOFLAM designator. Full package, taken from the Delta 5 inspection lot. She looked at him steadily. "SEAL Team 6 draws from Delta 5 supply for the Pacific rotation. You are scheduled for a readiness evaluation and potential deployment brief in 19 days. Garrett was very still. "The same package," Sierra continued, "appeared in field reporting from an engagement 6 months ago at a location I am not cleared to name. The unit involved suffered 3 casualties at ranges that should have been outside effective threat distance with standard equipment. They were operating without the thermal attachment from their original issue. It had been swapped during a base inspection 4 days before deployment. The paperwork showed the attachment as never having been part of the issue." Garrett pushed off from the wall. "You are telling me," he said, "that someone is stripping precision equipment from units before they go out, the units are going in short, and the equipment is ending up on the opposing side." "I am telling you that is what the data shows," Sierra said. "I am also telling you this is the same pattern my father identified. He tracked it for 6 months. He believed the equipment was being transferred to provide targeting capability against American forces in specific operational corridors." She paused. 3 weeks after he submitted his findings through internal channels, he was assigned to a classified field operation. He was listed as missing 3 weeks after that. The ventilation hummed. A radio somewhere in the building crackled once and went quiet. "5 years ago," Garrett said. "5 years ago," Sierra confirmed. "And you've been tracking this since." "I've been in this supply position for 8 months. I requested the assignment." She picked up the clipboard. "I am not here to build a case or prove a theory to people who don't want to hear it. I am here because the pattern matches, the timing matches, and the next unit in the rotation is yours. If I am right, you have 19 days before your equipment draw, and whoever is running this operation has already identified your team as the next target." She said it the way her father had taught her to say the things that needed saying quietly, directly, without decoration, and then stop. Haynes looked at the grid. He looked at Garrett. He looked at the young woman standing in his range control building at 0730 on a Thursday morning, who had in the previous hour demonstrated shooting that most career marksmen would recognize as exceptional, and had then laid on his table 8 months of cross-referenced intelligence, suggesting a theft and compromise network embedded in a United States military supply chain. "How long have you had this and not put it through official channels?" he said. "Since I confirmed the 8th item 3 weeks ago. I did not report it because I did not know who to report it to." She met his eyes without flinching. "My father reported it through official channels and was dead in 6 weeks. I needed to know who I could trust before I said a word to anyone." Haynes was quiet. Outside the reinforced window, the firing line sat in the morning heat. The range flags hung still. The targets waited at their distances. "You walked onto my range this morning," Garrett said slowly, "and shot that rifle in front of my team to see how I would respond to being corrected by someone I'd already dismissed." Sierra did not confirm this. She also did not deny it. "My father used to say," she said, "that the most dangerous man on any team is the one who cannot update his assessment when the information changes. I needed to know whether you were that man before I showed you any of this." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. He had spent 20 years building a reputation on the accuracy of his judgments. He was looking at a 21-year-old supply specialist who had in the past 40 minutes corrected his zero outshot, his team's qualification standard, and produced an intelligence assessment sophisticated enough to land her in a classified briefing. He pulled a chair from the wall and sat at the table. "Show me the grid," he said, "from the beginning." Sierra opened the clipboard. Outside, the sun cleared the ridgeline and the long shadows of the observation towers shortened and disappeared, and the day settled over Camp Pendleton with the flat certainty of California mornings that have decided what they are going to be. The flags did not move. The targets waited. The grid told a story that nobody had wanted to read. Sierra laid it across the operations table the way a surgeon lays out instruments before a procedure in sequence, each piece placed where it could be seen and reached. Haynes sat at the head of the table. Garrett sat to his left. Declan Frost had come inside at some point without formal invitation and stood near the door with his arms crossed and his eyes moving steadily across the documents. 8 months of work, 14 entries, each one a piece of equipment that had existed on paper until it didn't, that had been present in an inspection log until the Y was quietly revised, that had moved from a controlled supply cage to somewhere else, while the paperwork closed behind it like water closing over a stone. The first 6 thefts were spread across 3 bases, Sierra said. She kept her voice factual, stripped of interpretation. Her father had taught her that intelligence briefings worked best when they resembled weather reports. Here is what is happening. Here is the evidence. Here is what the pattern suggests. Opinion comes last, if at all. Fort Irwin Pendleton and 29 Palms. Timing irregular enough that no single inspector would see the pattern. Different supply chains, different lot numbers, different inspection windows. Garrett studied the grid with the scanning pattern he used on a range not random, but systematic, looking for what was consistent and what was anomalous. But the deviation window is the same. 4 to 7 days post-inspection, every time long enough that the inspection is filed and closed, short enough that the equipment hasn't reached the drawing unit. Which means someone has advance access to the inspection schedule, Declan said. And to the paperwork system afterward, Sierra said. Haynes had not spoken in several minutes. He was doing a specific kind of arithmetic, not addition, but the more complicated calculation, where a set of numbers tells you something about a set of people, and you do not enjoy the destination the arithmetic is moving toward. "Walk me through a specific incident," Garrett said. Sierra pulled a single sheet from beneath the grid. She had prepared this. She had prepared all of it in a specific order because she had rehearsed this briefing dozens of times across 8 months, and in every version the evidence needed to speak before anyone had the opportunity to dismiss the person presenting it. November of last year, a joint task force out of a forward position in the Southwest drew equipment from the same Delta 5 lot your team is scheduled to pull from. Their thermal package was replaced during a base inspection 4 days before deployment, swapped for a previous generation unit. Lower resolution, shorter effective range. The paperwork showed the advanced thermal as never having been part of the original issue. She set the sheet on the table. They deployed without knowing they were short. They were in low light conditions at approximately 900 meters when they made contact with a ground element using advanced thermal targeting to acquire them. She paused. 3 casualties. The after-action report attributed the losses to the operational environment. The equipment discrepancy was noted as a clerical matter and referred to supply for resolution. "Was it resolved?" Declan asked. The file was closed 11 days later. No equipment was recovered. No corrective action was documented. Garrett leaned back. "Your father found this. He found the first 4. He tracked the pattern for 6 months before I knew any of it. I only have what he found because of what he left behind." She was quiet for a moment. "He documented everything outside the official system. When he understood the scope, he submitted his findings to his direct chain of command." She looked at Haynes. "After that, he was assigned to a classified field operation and listed as missing 3 weeks later." "You are drawing a connection between his report and his disappearance," Haynes said. "I am drawing the connection the timeline draws," Sierra said. She let the silence work. Her father had been a man who understood silence as a tool, who applied it the way he applied trigger pressure, exactly as much as needed, and no more. She waited. The photograph had been in her jacket pocket since she left her quarters that morning. She set it on the table without preamble. A standard 5x7 print worn at the edges from months of handling. It showed a forward operating position, dusty ground, temporary structures, the indeterminate backdrop of American military operations in a dozen different places across a decade and a half. In the foreground, her father stood with 2 other men. He was smiling. The smile was the kind men produce when they are tired and doing hard work in uncomfortable conditions, and something has struck them as briefly and genuinely funny. It did not reach his eyes all the way, but it was real. He had sent her the photograph 2 weeks before he was listed as missing. No note, no explanation, just the photograph in an envelope with her name in his handwriting. She had looked at it for a long time before she understood what he was showing her. Background, she said, behind the figures to the right, the equipment cases. Garrett leaned forward. The cases were standard military transit containers partially visible behind a temporary structure, not the subject of the photograph. But they were in focus because Thomas Callahan had been a man who understood focal planes and depth of field, and when he pointed a camera at something, every element in the frame was exactly as clear as he intended. Garrett picked up the magnifying loupe from the equipment cabinet and held it over the image. He was quiet for a long time. "Read me those serial numbers," he said. His voice had shifted. Sierra read them from her notes. She had transcribed them months ago painstakingly from the photograph using the same loupe, or one identical to it. Garrett set the loupe down. He picked up the supply requisition sheet from the table, the document listing the equipment SEAL Team 6 was scheduled to draw from the Delta 5 lot in 19 days. He ran his finger down the column of serial numbers and stopped. He went back to be certain. "This equipment," he said, "these specific cases, photographed at a forward position." He looked at Sierra. "When?" "2 weeks before my father was listed as missing. 5 years ago. And 3 of those serial numbers appear in the lot your team is drawing from in 19 days. Reintroduced into inventory 14 months ago," Sierra said. "The system shows a contractor delivery. The documentation exists, but the contractor never received payment for that specific line item because the equipment was never purchased from them. It was already in the system. It needed new paperwork, not new merchandise." Haynes said quietly, "That requires access to the procurement database, the supply chain tracking system, and the contractor payment authorization process." "Yes, that is not a clerical error." "No." The room absorbed this. Outside the window, the rest of the team was visible along the berm. Brennan Saul behind his rifle. Crawford Finch talking with Whitakers, the ordinary surface of a morning on an active range. Everything looking like what it was supposed to look like. The way things looked when something deeply wrong is hiding inside something entirely routine. Garrett looked at Sierra. "Your father sent you that photograph because he knew what was going to happen when he filed the report." She did not answer. The answer was in her face, and looking at it directly was uncomfortable, so he looked at the photograph instead. Thomas Wraith Callahan had sent his daughter a photograph containing in its background the evidence that would explain his disappearance 2 weeks before he disappeared. Without a note, because a note would have been intercepted. He had trusted her to find what he hid, to wait until she had the right audience, and to present it correctly. She had taken 8 months. Patient, methodical, and visible. He had taught her that too. The alert from the North Depot came through at 13:47 hours. Haynes stepped out to take it. He was gone 4 minutes. When he returned, his expression had the specific quality of a man receiving confirmation of something he did not want confirmed. "North Depot," he said. "Breach attempt. Shinji." He looked at Sierra. "Section G is where the Delta 5 lot is currently staged." Sierra was already on her feet. The drive took 7 minutes. Nobody said anything that was not operationally necessary, which meant nobody said anything. The silence of people who have arrived at the same conclusion separately and are not yet ready to say it out loud because saying it makes it fully real. The access door to Section G had been forced cleanly with a tool designed for that specific lock type, not the kind of tool available at hardware stores. The security sergeant gave his report in the clipped manner of someone who had processed many scenes like this one and was careful not to interpret beyond the evidence. Professional entry, no prints, no footprints on standard surfaces. One partial boot impression in the northeast corner near the secondary stack. Camera was offline for 11 minutes starting at 13:31. Signal interruption, directed device close range. Garrett looked at Sierra. Sierra was looking at the secondary stack in the northeast corner. She walked to it, read the case labels, came back. "The 3 items," she said, "the ones matching the photograph serial numbers. They are all in this stack." Nobody spoke. "They came to confirm location," she said. "Not to move yet. They came to make sure the items are where the paperwork says they are." Haynes was on his radio. Garrett stood at the forced entry point and looked at the tool marks and thought about things he did not say out loud, specifically about a man he had served with at Fort Bragg 14 years ago, whose name had appeared in Sierra's briefing documents as a possible coordinator, a man whose official record stated he had died in theater in Iraq approximately 3 years prior. He thought about the profile of what he was looking at, the entry technique, the camera disruption method, the deliberate restraint and confirm out, no escalation. He filed it in the part of his mind that would continue working on it, whether he asked it to or not. They were back at the range control building by 1600 hours. The afternoon heat had settled fully into the complex. The team had been recalled from the firing line and now occupied the main room in the arrangements of men who are waiting for information, some on chairs, some on equipment cases. Brennan Saul on the floor against the wall, cross-legged hands in his lap, saying nothing and registering everything. Sierra gave the full briefing to the assembled team that she had given Haynes and Garrett that morning. She did not abbreviate. She went through it the same way, factually, sequentially, evidence visible throughout. The team listened with the quality of attention that develops in people who have spent years in environments where incomplete attention was indistinguishable from the decision to die. Crawford Finch, who had made a remark about coffee at 07:30 that morning that he now appeared to regret, deeply listened without speaking. Whitakers. His left leg extended with a field dressing wrapped below the knee where a ricochet off the depot floor had opened a gash during the brief engagement when base security had encountered the breach team departing. He had not mentioned it until Declan noticed the dark stain on his pants leg in the vehicle and told him to sit down, listened with his eyes fixed on the documents. Brennan Saul looked at nothing in particular and absorbed everything. Declan asked 3 questions, all technical, all precise. When Sierra finished, the room was quiet with the specific quality that follows information that cannot be unheard, not shock, but the recalibration that happens when new facts land on existing structures and change what the structures mean. Garrett said, "The photograph. You've had it 5 years. I've known what it contained for 8 months. Before that, it was just a photograph of my father. What changed 8 months ago? I got procurement database access through the supply assignment. I started cross-referencing serial numbers from documents my father left behind with current inventory records." She paused. The match on 3 items took 4 weeks to confirm. Brennan Saul spoke, which caused the room to pay a particular kind of attention because Brennan rarely chose to. "The November incident," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. 3 casualties at 900 meters. Low-light contact thermal targeting from the opposing element. He looked at Garrett. "That was the 4th SFG element that went ahead of the rotational evaluation last year. We trained with 2 of those men." A beat. "Rodriguez," Crawford said, not a question. "Yes," Brennan said. Crawford looked at the equipment table. He sent a photo to the group thread when his daughter was born. October, little girl. He said it to no one specifically. Nobody responded because there was nothing adequate to say. The distance between supply chain data and what supply chain data actually costs, measured in specific names and photographs sent to group threads in October, had collapsed completely. Garrett looked at the table. Sierra looked at her hands. "What do you need from us?" Garrett said. The alert came at 18:23 hours. Base security, a convoy of vehicles approaching the North Depot perimeter from an unmapped western access road. No unit identification. Personnel count 12 to 20. No scheduled delivery or inspection corresponding to the approach. Garrett was moving before he finished reading. 5 instructions in 15 seconds. The team deployed with the efficiency of people who had done this enough times that the doing did not require the thinking, each man knowing his position before he was told, because the positions had been established through years of repetition and trust. Declan east. Brennan elevated. Crawford and Witt wide right. Haynes coordinating with base security from the vehicle. Sierra was beside Garrett. He did not tell her to stay. She did not ask for permission to come. There is a specific professional understanding that develops between people who have shared a real briefing, not a presentation, but the kind where both parties carry the same information and both understand what it requires, and it had formed between them somewhere in the middle of the afternoon. She carried her rifle. The North Depot at 18:30 had the flat, hard light of late afternoon that had decided not to leave. Shadows, absolute spaces between them, very bright. Good light for a marksman. Bad light for anyone moving in the open. 4 vehicles had stopped at the perimeter fence. 12 men in tactical equipment had dismounted and taken positions that reflected training, not base security, training, not standard military patrol procedure, but the training that teaches you to think about fields of fire before you think about anything else. The arrangement was professional and deliberate, and spoke of people who had done this kind of work in a variety of settings. Garrett assessed this in 4 seconds. He communicated his assessment to Declan in 7 words. Then the lead vehicle's door opened, and Garrett saw who stepped out, and the assessment recalculated entirely. He knew the walk before he knew the face. 14 years had added weight and taken other things, But the walk was unchanged, that specific forward-leaning gait that came from a left hip injury sustained during a hard vehicle exit from a place that neither of them could have named in writing at the time. They had been in the vehicle together. Garrett had helped him out of it. Colonel Reeve Drummond had been listed as killed in action in Iraq 3 years and 4 months ago. His service record was closed. His commendations had been delivered to next of kin. Garrett had attended the ceremony at Fort Bragg because that was what you did when a man you had served beside died. He was standing 40 meters away in the late afternoon light, speaking into a radio, observing the depot perimeter, with the particular attention of someone who had done this kind of operation many times and was confident in the outcome. Garrett said nothing. His face did not change. In the specific silence of his assessment, something that lived between grief and rage passed through and was filed where it needed to go, not suppressed, but held until the work permitted it. "You know him," Sierra said. Beside him, one step back, her voice carrying 3 feet and no further. "Fort Bragg, 2008 to 2010. Garrett kept his eyes on Drummond. "He was someone I trusted. Was he capable of this then?" Garrett considered the question honestly. He was capable of anything he decided was worth the cost. The question is, what someone showed him that made this worth it. Drummond raised a bullhorn. "Callahan," his amplified voice crossed the flat ground without personality, reduced to pure instruction. "We know you're in the facility. We know what you pulled from this morning's briefing. Come out. Bring what you have. Nobody needs to escalate this." The language was careful, attempting resolution before force, which meant someone above Drummond had made that decision, which meant there was someone above Drummond. Sierra was already moving, left into the shadow of the depot wall, using the building the way her father had taught her to use any structure, as a tool, not a destination. She was through the secondary entrance and on the upper level in the time it took the lead element to reach the primary door. She found position at a window opening that gave her the angle she needed. Drummond stood in the open with the posture of a man who believed he was in a position of overwhelming force, not careless, but without the specific physical attention to cover that a person pays when they genuinely expect to take fire. Her father had told her once that the most dangerous opponent is the one who believes himself untouchable. That belief creates a gap between perceived safety and actual exposure, and that gap is measurable in degrees and distances. She found the gap. "Garrett," she said into her radio, "I have Drummond." "Hold," Garrett said. "Drummond." Garrett's voice came from the eastern approach, carrying without amplification the way voices carry when they have something true in them. "You know who I am, and you know what I'm looking at. You have 4 vehicles and 12 men in a position that Brennan Saul has been indexing from elevation for the last 6 minutes. You want to tell me who sent you here, or do you want to see how the next 3 minutes develop?" A silence spread across the depot. Drummond lowered the bullhorn. He looked toward Garrett's voice and then at the roofline where Brennan was, which he had not identified, and then at the upper window where Sierra was, which he identified immediately because Drummond had always been good. He spoke into his radio, too low to hear. "Reeve," Garrett said, "last chance to do this the way that doesn't end everything simultaneously." Drummond fired 1 round into the air. The old signal. His men repositioned behind vehicles, weapons up. Sierra fired, not at Drummond, not at his men. The radio disintegrated in Drummond's left hand. The second round found the engine block of the lead vehicle, and steam erupted from the hood in a white column, catching the late light. The third, fourth, and fifth rounds took the front tires of the remaining 3 vehicles in a sequence too fast for the men taking cover to track. 5 shots, 3 seconds, then all mechanical. Every person in the perimeter untouched. Garrett's voice without amplification carrying the way true things carry. "Next set of options is less favorable for your side, Reeve." Drummond stood in the middle of his immobilized formation. He was calculating. Garrett could see him calculating from 40 meters, had watched this man calculate his way out of difficult situations before in different places for different employers. He ran the numbers. He gestured to his men. They pulled back on foot with the discipline of people who had agreed on this contingency in advance. Professional, no panic, no further shots. At the perimeter fence, Drummond stopped and looked back. Not at Garrett, at the upper window. There was something in his face that lived between recognition and something more complicated. Then he went through the fence and was gone. Base security arrived 90 seconds later. The debrief happened in Haynes' office, which had absorbed over many years a residue of the difficult conversations it had hosted, a quality of gravity in the walls. Haynes behind his desk, Garrett across from him, Sierra standing near the window because the chairs were taken and she had been the one standing when they ran out. Drummond's official record says he's dead, Haynes said. He is not, Garrett said. No, which means someone decided his record would say that, and that decision required authorization at the general officer level. Haynes looked at his desk, a long pause that was doing work words were not equipped to do. Sierra found the section in her documents. A name appearing 3 times in the authorization chain of the supply system modifications. Once in the deployment scheduling for her father's last operation. Once in the general officer roster covering the period of Drummond's reported death. She set the document on Haynes's desk and placed her finger beside the name. General Stanton Voss. Haynes looked at the name for a long time with the expression of a man looking at the result of an arithmetic problem he had been running slowly for years, hoping to arrive at a different answer. I have known Stanton Voss for 30 years, he said. Not exculpation, not a question. A fact that needed to be said aloud once before he could move past it. He moved past it. What do you need, he said to Sierra, to complete this? Sierra looked at the documents on the desk. She thought about what her father had known and what he had done with it and what had followed. Access to the full personnel and deployment records from my father's last operation, she said. Not the standard file, the complete record. That requires authorization above my level. I know. She met his eyes. I need to confirm that Voss signed the deployment order. And if he did, I need to know who authorized the subsequent cover Drummond's death notification, the investigation closure, the procurement modifications. None of that runs on one general's authority. The room was quiet. Outside, the installation had moved into evening. Exterior lights were warming against the darkening sky. The normal rhythms of a working base surface undisturbed, continuing without acknowledgement of what was being discussed 30 feet away in a colonel's office. Haynes picked up his desk phone. He looked at the name on the document once more. He began to dial. Sarah stood at the window. The installation lights had made the glass into a mirror, and in the mirror she could see the room, Garrett at the desk, Haynes on the phone, the documents spread across every available surface. 8 months of work made physical occupying space. She thought about her father somewhere, alive or not alive, 5 years into a silence she had never stopped trying to break. She thought about the thread that was still loose. She intended to pull it. The call from Cobb Dunleavy came at 0214 hours on a frequency that had not been active in 5 years. Sierra had known the frequency was coming before she knew it was Dunleavy. She had found it in a notebook her father had left in a storage unit registered under a name she did not recognize, tucked inside the back cover of a technical manual on environmental ballistics that she had located in the 3rd month of her supply assignment, following a chain of small directions her father had embedded in documents he had left behind in locations only someone who knew how he thought would think to look. The notebook contained 3 things: the frequency, the coordinates of the supply unit, where she should request assignment, in a single line in her father's handwriting. If Viper calls, answer. He kept his word when I could not keep mine. Cobb Dunleavy, Staff Sergeant, officially killed in action in the same ambush that had taken Thomas Callahan. Unofficially, the man who had been feeding Sierra information across 8 months through encrypted channels she had known only as Viper Actual, communicating in pieces and fragments, never more than the moment's risk permitted, waiting for the case to reach the threshold where a single call could complete it. When his voice came through at 0214, she was already awake at the desk in the temporary quarters Haynes had arranged, working through the personnel records Haynes had unlocked at 2130 after a phone call that had lasted 47 minutes. Junior. His voice was stripped to essentials, the voice of a man who has been underground for a long time and is choosing each word with the awareness that this may be the last good opportunity. This is Dunleavy. I knew your father. He told me about you. He told me this frequency. A pause with 5 years of weight in it. He is alive. He has been alive the whole time. I can tell you where. She knocked on Garrett's door 30 seconds later. The briefing at 0300 in the range control building was brief because it needed to be brief. Dunleavy had given her 12 minutes of compressed information: coordinates, facility description, personnel, estimate the structure of the shifts and the rotation of the guards, and the location within the complex where Wraith was being held. The facility was a decommissioned SIGINT station in the southern Arizona desert built during the Cold War, removed from official records when the infrastructure became redundant, reactivated approximately 4 years ago, under the cover of a private security contractor that existed on paper and nowhere else. It was not on any map that could be found through standard channels. It was on the map that Dunleavy had been building for 5 years. Personnel count, Garrett said. The satellite imagery Haynes had pulled showed a low complex of concrete structures around a central communications array. Flat desert on 3 sides. Single access road north. Two elevated observation positions covering the approach. Dunleavy estimated 22 total, Sierra said. 18 on at any given time. Same contractor profile as the depot team. Drummond's network, Declan said. Drummond is the operational layer. He sources and coordinates. But he doesn't fund and doesn't direct the overall structure. That comes from above Voss. She looked at the imagery. The drive my father kept Dunleavy believes it contains the next layer. Not the top, the direction. Garrett studied the approach angles. Walk me through the plan. Sierra had been building the plan since the moment Dunleavy gave her the coordinates. She laid it out as her father had taught her to lay out any problem, what is known, what is inferred, where the boundary between them sits. She would lead the intelligence element. She had the facility description, the personnel pattern, the full picture of what they were looking for. Garrett would command the tactical execution because Garrett had 20 years of direct action experience, and she did not, and that distinction was not hierarchy, it was function. The right person in the position that matched their capability. Brennan Saul and Crawford Finch to the western ridge, 300 meters from the perimeter, covering the primary approach in the communications array. Declan to the power infrastructure on the southern edge, a transformer array behind a secondary building, 80 meters from the main structure. When the power went 90 seconds before emergency systems activated. Garrett's element breaching from the east, drawing attention and response. Sierra through the northern access alone to find her father. You have never done a direct action entry, Declan said. Factual, not accusatory. No, Sierra said, but Dunleavy confirmed my father is in the northern block. Furthest point from the primary response. If Garrett's element creates what it is going to create, the northern block is the last place anyone looks. She paused. I know how my father thinks. I know what he will do when the shooting starts. I need to be there when he does it. Garrett had been quiet. He was evaluating not just the plan, but the person presenting it, the specific quality of her certainty, what it was grounded in, whether it was the certainty of preparation or the certainty of someone who had not yet imagined failure clearly enough. He had been watching her since 700 the previous morning. He had his answer. What else is in the northern block, he said. Dunleavy was not certain. He had seen food deliveries for at least 4 people, possibly more. So we go in not knowing what we are extracting. We go in knowing we extract everyone, Sierra said. We determine who they are when they are out. Garrett looked at the imagery one more time, then at the clock. Wheels up in 90 minutes, he said. They drove rather than flew because the flight profile required authorizations Haynes was not prepared to create in writing, and because the facility was 4 hours by vehicle across terrain that would not be monitored at 0400 on a Thursday. 3 vehicles running dark moving south and east through the specific quality of California pre-dawn that feels like the world is holding its breath. Sierra sat in the second vehicle with Garrett. Neither slept. Tell me about him, Garrett said somewhere in the second hour. The desert was flat and dark on both sides of the road. My father. Yes. She thought about this, carefully separating biography from truth. He was patient, she said. Not by nature, by practice. He told me once that patience is not a personality trait, it is a skill, and skills degrade without maintenance. She was quiet for a moment. He applied it to everything, shooting obviously, but also to people, to situations. He had a way of waiting for the right moment that most people I've met simply don't have. Another pause. He saw the whole field, not just the target. Garrett was quiet. Then Afghanistan 2019, the 3 men I told you about. What I have never told anyone is that I saw a discrepancy in the equipment issue before that deployment, and I decided it was clerical. I wrote it in my notes and marked it for follow-up, and then the operation moved forward, and I followed it. He kept his eyes on the road. Rodriguez was on that team. Hess was on that team. The road continued in front of them. I know, Sierra said. I'm telling you so you understand why I'm in this vehicle. She understood. She had understood since the afternoon when she watched his face change over the depot documents and realized that what she had brought him was not new information, but the name for something he had been carrying for 4 years without one. She had given the thing a name and a supply chain and a general's signature, and now he could do something with the weight. My father would say, Sierra said that the worst mistakes are the ones you cannot correct, but the second worst are the ones you can correct and choose not to. Garrett looked at the road ahead of them, at the darkness past the headlights of the lead vehicle. We're going to correct it, he said. The facility appeared out of the desert at 0538 in the way that things built to be invisible, Peer when you know exactly where to look, suddenly completely present, as if it had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Brennan and Crawford split off 3 kilometers out, moving on foot toward the western ridge, with the economy of men who had long ago made peace with the relationship between heavy equipment and difficult terrain. They would be in position before the assault element reached the perimeter. Declan took his element south, cutting wide to approach the power infrastructure from an angle the observation positions did not cover. Garrett and Sierra and 2 others moved to the eastern approach and held at 200 meters. Sierra went north. She moved through the desert the way her father had taught her to move through any terrain, treating concealment as a fluid condition rather than a fixed one, becoming part of the landscape's natural variation rather than hiding behind individual features. Shadow and distance, and the way human eyes fill in gaps with what they expect to find. She reached the northern perimeter at 0547. The northern block was exactly where Dunleavy had described it, a single-story concrete structure set back from the main complex, connected by a covered walkway, one exterior light above a single door. The light cast a 6-meter circle of yellow into the pre-dawn dark. Sierra lay outside that circle and waited. At 0558, Declan's voice low and certain in her earpiece, power in 30. She moved to the edge of the light circle. At 0559, the facility went dark. She was through the door in the 12 seconds before the emergency systems activated, moving by the map Dunleavy had given her, memory down a corridor that smelled of concrete and recycled air, and the particular institutional flatness of places designed for containment rather than habitation. Emergency lighting came on at a low red level, enough for shapes in movement, not enough for faces. From the eastern side of the complex, Garrett's element announced itself. The controlled, directed sound of a professional breach, and then the kind of noise that collapses every trained response in a building full of armed men to a single point of reference. The northern quarter stayed quiet. Sierra moved through it. 4 doors on the left. The first unlocked and empty. The second and third locked, keypads dark defaulted to locked in the power failure. The 4th door was open. Not forced, simply open. As if someone inside had been waiting for exactly this kind of darkness and had been ready to move the instant it arrived. She stepped through. The man standing in the center of the room was not the man in her memory. He was thinner. He stood differently, favoring his left side in the specific way that comes not from a single injury, but from years of adapting to injury without adequate treatment. His hair was more gray than dark. Lines in his face that had not been there in the photograph she had been carrying for 5 years. But the way he was standing, centered in the room, oriented toward the door, weight balanced, hands open and visible, that was the same. Exactly the same, because Thomas Callahan had taught his daughter to stand that way in the presence of uncertainty, and he had never stopped doing it himself. She said, "Dad." He looked at her for a moment that had no measurable duration. Then wait. "Akers, you used old data for the personnel count at the depot." The ricochet caught him below the knee. She had known he would know. Dunleavy had told him everything across the 8 months, every step she had taken. "He's operational," she said. "It's healing." The mistake cost him. He was already moving toward the door, assessing the corridor with the quick efficiency of someone who had been monitoring this building's rhythms for nearly 5 years. "Is he aware it was the old data?" "Yes." "Good, then we don't discuss it again." He checked the corridor. "We need to move." That was the reunion, delivered at low voice in a red-lit corridor, with the sounds of the Eastern engagement carrying through the walls. Sierra had imagined this moment in 100 variations across 5 years and 8 months, and in none of them had it been this clipped, immediate, already moving, already on the next thing. It was exactly right. Her father stopped at the second locked door. He produced a key card from inside his clothing. "This lock has a manual override. The power failure doesn't affect," he said. "They changed the system 4 months ago. I watched them change it, and I watched the code being entered once, and I waited 12 weeks for a second opportunity to confirm it." He ran the card. The lock released. "Your grandfather was a patient man." Inside were 3 people. A man in his late 30s in the remains of a Marine uniform who came to his feet immediately and moved toward the door with the focused attention of someone running on conviction rather than physical reserves. A woman in her 40s who identified herself in 3 words as Air Force, and whose voice contained everything she was not going to say in this moment but would say later. A third person who gave no name and no branch, and who moved with the specific minimal efficiency of someone for whom anonymity was professional rather than personal. This third person paused beside Sierra as they reached the vehicles. He said, in a voice meant for her alone, Your father kept us alive by convincing them 3 times over that we were worth more breathing than not. Each time they ran the calculation, he changed the answer. A pause. Whatever he asks of you next, it's worth it. He got into the vehicle and did not speak again. Her father reached beneath the collar of his borrowed jacket and removed a flat object no larger than a thumbnail, sealed in a strip of medical-grade waterproof dressing. He held it out. She recognized the casing. She had seen it before in a photograph he had sent her when she was 16, his field kit laid out on a wooden table, somewhere unidentifiable. One item circled in pen with a note beneath it. Everything that matters fits in something this small, if you are careful about what matters. He had kept it sealed in a cavity behind a loose concrete block in the wall of the northern block in the room he had been allowed to occupy alone for 6 hours each day, because the people running the facility had decided that a man with nowhere to go and nothing to do was not a security risk. They had been profoundly wrong about what a man with nowhere to go does with his time. 5 years of what I found in there, he said. It is not complete. It is a direction. The extraction was not clean. Clean extractions are a feature of planning documents and after-action reports written at sufficient distance to permit charitable interpretation. What happened in the 22 minutes between Sierra's radio call and the moment the last vehicle cleared the facility's outer perimeter was contested loud and conducted against a force that had recovered from its initial shock faster than the sleep rotation data had suggested it would. Crawford Finch took a round through his left forearm 40 meters from the perimeter fence. He registered it, transferred his rifle to his right hand, and kept moving. Finch, Garrett said, through and through, not leaking badly. Later. Now. Later. Garrett looked at him for 1 second and made the decision. The field always requires a manage what you can manage, except what you cannot keep moving. Sierra was managing the movement of 3 people whose physical condition ranged from diminished to barely functional. The Marine moved under his own power and kept his borrowed rifle correctly indexed. The Air Force officer moved on will more than reserves. The third person required no management. Her father was at the rear. He was covering the withdrawal with the methodical accuracy of a man who had been in this desert for nearly 5 years and had spent the time that wasn't occupied with survival, doing the thing that his training and his nature would not allow him to stop doing, maintaining his skills in whatever ways captivity permitted, observing his captors, building the mental map of every approach and departure angle in his vicinity. He fired sparingly. Each round placed the way a craftsman places a tool, one strike, correct result next. Sierra was 30 meters ahead of him, keeping the group oriented, making decisions about cover and pace and direction in real time. She made 2 errors in positioning that she recognized as errors in the moment and corrected as quickly as they could be corrected. The errors cost nothing, but she noted them and filed them for later examination in the place her father had taught her to keep things that needed waiting. What she was doing was holding the group together, not through perfect tactics, but through the quality of directed presence that keeps frightened and exhausted people moving in the right direction. The quality of someone who knows where they are going and communicates that knowledge without requiring people to understand every step of how they will get there. Garrett saw it from the forward element position. He noted it thoroughly without comment, the way he noted things that would matter later. They reached the vehicles at 0631. The desert was beginning to gray at its edges. The facility behind them had quieted Brennan and Crawford's elevated position, having made the eastern approach untenable, and the departure making continued engagement impractical. Her father stood at the vehicle and looked back at the facility complex with the expression of a man settling an account. "There is more in the drive than Voss," he said. She looked at him. "Voss is the mechanism. Someone built the mechanism and funds it and has been directing it for approximately 18 to 20 years, operating through layers of separation that have kept the center protected across multiple administrations and multiple administrations' investigations." He looked at the drive in his hand. "What I have gives you the direction, not the destination." "We will find the destination," Sierra said. He looked at her with the expression of a man evaluating a statement for accuracy rather than comfort. "Yes," he said, "we will." They got into the vehicle. The arrest of General Stanton Voss did not happen that day. It happened 31 hours later, after Haynes had moved the authorization through the channels he had begun working at 0300 on the night of the Arizona operation, through people who agreed to look at specific documents and who then one by one stopped finding an innocent explanation for what they were looking at. Voss was apprehended at his residence in McLean, Virginia, on a Tuesday morning, while his car was being loaded for what appeared to be a planned departure. He did not resist. He had the expression of a man who had known this moment was coming and had calculated how long he could delay it and had arrived at a number that proved accurate. Sierra was not there. She was in the base hospital hallway outside the room where Crawford Finch was having his forearm addressed by a surgical team that had been given instructions about the patient's name and the nature of the injury in the specific complete terms that military medical personnel receive when something is classified. Crawford's voice came through the door at intervals. He was engaged in a disagreement with the surgeon about the suturing technique. The surgeon appeared to be winning, but only barely. Garrett sat 2 chairs down from Sierra in the hallway. Forearms on his knees, looking at nothing specific, running through the events of the previous 30 hours in the systematic way he ran through everything, checking for what could have been done differently and what could not have been changed, and filing each one accordingly. Haynes signed the arrest authorization, he said. For a man he has known 30 years, he signed it and said nothing about it. Some things don't require words, Sierra said. The signing is the statement. Garrett looked at the hallway floor. A man who's known someone 3 decades, signs the order, says nothing. My father would say that silence at the right moment carries more weight than any explanation. The explanation is for your own comfort. The signature is for everyone else. Something that might have been a brief, genuine smile moved across Garrett's face. It did not stay long. Colonel Reeve Drummond was not found. His name entered the appropriate systems, and the appropriate alerts were generated, and the appropriate agencies were notified, and Drummond was not found because Drummond was the kind of man who had spent the most productive years of his career learning how not to be found, and those skills did not stop functioning simply because the career had changed its character. He was somewhere. He would surface when the conditions favored it. When he did, there would need to be people positioned and ready. Sierra intended to be among them. The range was empty at 1700 hours when she and her father walked back onto it. It looked different in the late afternoon. The same concrete, the same observation towers, the same steel targets at their measured distances. But the light was different, coming in low and flat, and gold across the valley floor. And the shadows fell at angles they had not held that morning, and she had become, in the 22 hours since she had last stood here, a different person in the specific incremental way that people become different when they have done something they were not certain they could do and found that they could. Her father walked beside her to the firing line and stood looking at the distances the way he always stood, looking at distances, not measuring, but acknowledging. The way you acknowledge things that are what they are. He had told her at 1400 hours in the room Haynes had found time for, though the day's operations did not technically permit it. He had told her without apology and without extended explanation, because those were not the tools he used for things that required precision. Dunleavy had confirmed 3 additional sites connected to the Architect network. The intelligence on the drive was enough to identify them, but not enough to close them. If Voss's arrest accelerated the network's transition, and it would, her father was certain of this, the window for the next step was measured in weeks. He needed to move before the network sealed the gaps his 5 years of observation had opened. He could not move, as Thomas Callahan, known, recovered operating with his real face attached to his real name at a base in Southern California. He needed to disappear again. She had sat with this for 2 hours. Not his death, not his disappearance. His deliberate departure, chosen, calculated, necessary. The thing she had spent 5 years and 8 months preventing was the thing he was now asking her to allow. She had said eventually, how long? He had said, less than 5 years. I know what I'm looking for now. She had not said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. She understood the work. She had been doing the work. She knew what it can't, and she knew what it was for. And the man standing across from her had made this calculation against the full weight of what 5 years away had already taken from him, and had arrived at the same answer he had arrived at before. Some things were larger than the people who carried them. Now he stood beside her on the firing line, and neither of them spoke for a stretch of time that had no particular length. The late sun was doing what it did over Pendleton in this season, coming in low and flat, and gold catching the steel targets at their distances and making them burn briefly before the light continued its movement. The thermal gradient, he said finally. You need to build the calculation before you take position. Not during, not after. Before. It should be as automatic as checking the wind. I know. You'll need to teach it. Rourke's team is good. They'll absorb it if someone takes the time. She looked at the 1,500-meter target, the one she had hit on her 8th shot on a morning that now existed on the far side of a significant distance. Will I hear from you, she said, through Dunleavy, when there is something to say. He paused. The frequency works both directions. She reached into her jacket and took out the coin he had given her, the one with the two figures, the larger and the smaller, the shadow and the one stepping out of it. She looked at the reverse of the smaller figure, the blank face of it, and thought about what he had said when he gave it to her years before he had actually given it to her. Not my legacy, your own thing. She closed her hand around it. He crouched and picked up a small stone from the edge of the firing line, a habit she had known since childhood, a gesture she had never asked about, and he had never explained, but that she associated with the specific quality of attention he brought to things just before he left them. He looked at it for a moment and set it on the equipment table with a deliberateness that made the setting down of a small stone feel like the completion of something. Junior, he said. She looked at him, he looked back. The kind of looking that covers territory quickly because the territory has been covered before many times in many forms, and both people know its shape. Then he said, 600 tomorrow. Don't be late. I'm never late. No, he said, you're not. He turned and walked off the range, and she watched him go until the angle of the building took him, and she did not call after him because there was nothing to call that would be more than what had already been said between them. The 5 years were in it. The photograph was in it. The frequency and the storage unit and the 8 months of patient, invisible work were all in it. The first shot at 350 meters when she was 7 years old was in it. She turned back to the firing line. The targets waited at their distances in the gold late light. The flags hung still. Behind her, the installation was moving through its evening lights, warming in the administrative buildings. The sound of the range being secured, the ordinary surface of a working base continuing without acknowledgement of what it contained. Garrett found her there 20 minutes later. He came onto the firing line and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, which was the correct thing to do. He reached into his jacket and held out a challenge coin. Standard SEAL Team 6 issue on one face. The reverse had been engraved with a date and the team's initials and nothing else. You did the work, he said. That was all. She took the coin, felt its weight alongside the other one in her palm. Your father, Garrett said. He'll be in contact when there's something to say. Garrett looked at the range, the offer to learn the breathing technique. 600 tomorrow, she said. All of you. He nodded. He stood with her for another moment in the way that people stand together after something significant when there are no adequate words for the significance present, quiet, allowing the silence to carry what language could not. Then he left. She was alone on the firing line. She thought about tomorrow at 615 men on this line learning something her father had spent 22 years developing and had given her as the very first thing before anything else when she was still too young to understand what she was receiving. She thought about Drummond moving patient, waiting for conditions to favor him. She thought about Architect, the name without a face, the center that the layers had been protecting for 18 to 20 years, who had never seen a real threat to the structure and did not yet know that the drive her father had kept for 5 years was now in hands that knew what to do with it. Her phone lit in her jacket. She took it out. The message was brief, from a number that would not exist by morning. The range at 0600 belongs to you now. Teach them what I taught you. I will be in touch when it matters. V. She looked at the message for a long time. She thought about the space between heartbeats, the way it opened, the way it held itself without impatience, without urgency available to anyone who had done the work to find it. She put the phone away. She picked up the stone her father had left on the equipment table. It was small and unremarkable, the kind of stone that exists in its millions on ranges and desert floors, and along the edges of roads that do not appear on any map. She turned it over in her hand, once feeling its weight, feeling how ordinary it was and what it nonetheless meant. She set it back down exactly where he had left it. Then she shouldered her rifle and walked back toward the lights. Behind her, the range settled into its nighttime quiet. The targets stood at their measured distances in the last of the gold. The flags hung still, and the space between heartbeats opened and held and waited the way it had always waited for someone patient enough to find it.